think we'll make a start. So, firstly, I would like to say thank you to Chido, without whom this wouldn't be possible. So thank you very much, Chido, for bringing this together and putting this together and organising this webinar this morning. And I think you were concentrating on letting people in. And I was going to ask if you would introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Jude. My name is Chido. I'm a project officer for the Collator Network for Forensic Mental Health Services based at the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And as Jude said, I've been helping to kind of organise this webinar. Yeah, we've got quite some very interesting speaker sessions in store for you, so I hope you all enjoy it.
I think helping is a bit of an understatement, Chido. This has been your project, and I'm very grateful to you for organising it. So welcome everybody. My name's Dr Jude Deacon. I'm Director of Forensic Mental Health at Oxford Health, and I'm Chair of the Quality Network Advisory Group. And so I'm welcoming you. I've now got eight pages of people, which is amazing. Welcoming you all here today for this webinar on cultures, on workplace cultures. So I'm going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. So firstly, as you've probably already seen by the little pop-up, the webinar is going to be recorded, or the presentation is going to be recorded. So we're hoping to get a really good discussion going on after the presentations in a more open way, and that won't be recorded. So just to bear in mind that. The event's going to be live tweeted. I kind of feel really self-conscious even saying that, but which I understand means that there'll be screenshots taken and shared via the platform formerly known as Twitter. So please just bear that in mind. If you're not comfortable with that, maybe pop off your cameras, and that's perfectly acceptable. So speaking of cameras, we've got large volumes of, I'm happy to say, 9 pages now, but upwards of 150 people now already on the session, and that might affect our bandwidth. Literally, not metaphorically. So if you've got issues with your connection, please again do pop your cameras off. If we've all got issues, we might have to ask people to pop their cameras off during the morning. So we'll just see how that goes. We're going to introduce some speakers in a while. My suggestion is that to the speakers that we take questions after each one, so that people have got immediate questions, they're kind of fresh. That feels like a sensible way of doing it. So please, in time-honoured fashion, pop your hand up electronically if you have a question for speakers when they've spoken. Chido and I will try and marshal the hands up, but also we have the chat function if you would like to pop questions into the chat. So we're here today to talk about culture and positive or not positive workplace cultures. And this really has arisen. We thought it would be helpful, as there have been conversations over the years during reviews, a lot of, I think, kind of thinking nationally and in media about cultures and the risk of closed cultures developing in specifically in our sector, but in other types of organisations as well, where there is a risk of people working in kind of silos and pockets and closed cultures developing. So lots of people have raised that over the years through the reviews, either of having direct experience of closed cultures emerging in their services, or identifying risks that there may be cultures, and a lot of thinking going on to how we can mitigate against that and what would be helpful in managing that risk. Just as a sort of benchmark, I suppose, I did a quick Google of what's the kind of bog standard definition of culture, being shared values, beliefs and behaviours that people adopt at any kind of given time. And in 2023, the CQC provided us with a definition of workplace culture as being the way people work, the way they think, and the way they act. So however we define it, I think probably we can all agree that it's crucial and very key to patient safety and the safe delivery of care, which of course is why we're all here today. And therefore it's an interesting and an important topic for us to think about. So we do have excellent speakers this morning, after which we're hoping to be able to have, albeit there are a lot of us here now, a very open conversation, and we're hoping that people will be able to share experiences they might have of thinking about closed culture, share experience perhaps they have of closed culture, or of work going on in their organisations, challenges, dilemmas, perhaps. It's a big space. That, as I say, the open discussion won't be recorded, so please have some mind to confidentiality. We'd like to be able to provide a safe space in which people can share their thoughts and ideas. So, are there any questions or comments about that before I introduce the first speaker? Lovely. I see no hands. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Charles King, who will you'll, I'm sure, introduce yourself more fully, Charles. I will declare an interest that Charles and I work together, and Charles is going to talk about a project in our directorate where we work around psychologically informed organisational consultancy in forensic mental health support teams and cultures. Charles, over to you. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, Jude. 150 people. I wasn't expecting 150 people.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
Wow. So, yes, so I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm also a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and I work in the Thames Valley Forensic Mental Health Service, which is a forensic service that covers 4 different counties: Oxfordshire, Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, and Milton Keynes. And Jude is the director of that service. So we've been thinking a lot over the last few years about team culture, and trying to understand how team cultures develop, and trying to understand how to help when team cultures are not helpful for the work that we do. And I guess it's very easy to understand how, given the really complicated clinical environments that we work in and the challenging patient group that we work in within forensics, that actually quite a lot of pressures come to bear on teams working, teams which are trying to do that work. And that over time, if that pressure keeps going and is sustained, that actually it can become crystallized into what one might call a culture in that team. And by culture, Jude's given us some definitions. I guess I tend to think of it as what you start to see is repeated patterns of relationship between staff members of that team, or repeated patterns of relationship between members of that team and the patients. And that starts to have an impact on the work. Now, it's very easy to see these cultures within any team, and sometimes they're helpful and sometimes they're unhelpful. What's more difficult is to understand what is it that's affecting these cultures? What is it that's keeping the culture going? What's maintaining it? And even more challenging, what can you do from the outside to try and nudge, support, encourage, or even require that a culture in the team has to change? So what I'm reporting today is over the last 3 years, we've developed one particular approach to sort of trying to help that, and that's using a kind of an organizational consultancy model that I've been involved in. So that's what I'm going to tell you a bit about. I'll just share my slides.
Charles, at the risk of interrupting you, I'm noticing you're periodically freezing a little bit. So okay. I'm going to encourage cameras off, I think, until question time, just in the interests of having a bit of better reception.
Is there anything that I can do, Jude?
I don't think so. No, I think
Right.
because it would be nice to see you as you present. So I
Yeah.
think if the rest of us pop off our cameras, that might help.
Okay. Can you see that?
Yes, very
Yeah.
well. Thank you.
Okay. I don't have a lot of slides though. So the question that we're asking is, how can we influence team cultures within the forensic mental health service? And just to give you a little bit of context of the service that I work, which I think is fairly typical of many different forensic mental health services. So we're a large service. It has multiple inpatient and a number of community-based teams, which are all multidisciplinary. All of them are managed and coordinated centrally with what we call the kind of forensic senior management team, of which Jude is the director, and also through kind of central professional departments, psychiatry, psychology, etc. But each team or each system, as I think of it, functions fairly independently. So each inpatient unit or each community team is fairly independent from the central organization. And each team has what we call a senior leadership team, which constitutes basically the senior members, professional members of that team, perhaps the consultant psychiatrist, the psychologist, the senior nurse, etc. And each of these teams are between 30 and 60 people, multidisciplinary, and as well, perhaps primarily nurses, particularly in inpatients. Now, in the kind of the busy day-to-day work, always responding to demands and challenges, there is rarely any time in these teams to think about the team itself and the processes that are happening in the team. I call them psychological processes, but really it's the patterns of interaction within the team, never mind thinking about the culture that's developing within the team. And that's the case. So the senior leadership team within each team doesn't have time to do that, never mind the team as a whole. And so what tends to happen is teams are just allowed to kind of develop and evolve with very little attempt to have any influence over the kind of culture that's developing within the team. I mean, typically what happens is that a new service or a service that's changing, you kind of set up the patient group, you set up the operational kind of expectations and outcomes, you define some roles, you recruit to those roles, and off they go. Off they go. And then the system, the team, is just allowed to sort of develop in some way. Now, not surprising, as the pressures on that team increase, it can start to develop into things which are not particularly helpful. Now, what we've noticed is that there are recurring patterns of difficulty which exist within teams. And in fact, every team goes at some point through a period of difficulty. And these are some of the patterns that we've noticed. There are patterns of difficulty in the leadership of those teams. So the local leadership team are often very good at kind of sort of managing the team, but not very good at setting the direction of the team. For instance, being clear about the model of care or the quality of care that's going to be offered. There's sometimes conflict within those leadership teams, perhaps between different professions. And occasionally there are senior members of those teams which are slightly distant and uninvolved. They don't particularly see their role as being involved in helping the team function. And so the team is hobbled by that lack of involvement. There's often difficulties with team cohesion, by which I mean not just in the leadership, but within the whole team. Perhaps different professional groups, the kind of the nurses not really working with the MDT, or difficulties within the nursing hierarchies are often present. Perhaps occasionally, if things are difficult, we start to see disengagement and a kind of sense of malaise within teams, and particularly disengagement in the sense that people stop getting involved in those processes which pertain to the team as a whole. So not attending staff meetings, not attending team meetings, not attending reflective practice, anything which is to do with the actual functioning of the team as a whole. People stop engaging and being thinking that it's relevant to them. Occasionally, perhaps even more severely, in the senior management team, we start seeing some difficulties in the relationship with patients. Perhaps we start hearing patterns of complaints or incidents, or a sense that a team is under stress and unhappy. And like Jude mentioned, we've been thinking very carefully after Edenfield last year, whether that kind of closed culture could evolve within our services. So closed cultures are when, particularly within inpatient services, and perhaps particularly vulnerable kind of nursing teams, become close to any external influence or any external scrutiny, and then those cultures evolve in a kind of an unrestrained way, potentially in very unhelpful ways. So what we've noticed is that with dominance of day-to-day process, it kind of veils an awareness of the team, or knowing what's happening in the team. And we hypothesized that maybe if a team had access to an external pair of eyes, which they could trust, then maybe that could help the team's own process of thinking about themselves as a team. And it could harness their own resourcefulness to try and make the team's culture become more skillful or more helpful. So that was the idea behind this post. And that would be a kind of an organizational consultant sort of framework. So point 4 of my post, I've been working for a long time in the service, and point 4 of my post became dedicated to this. The fact that I'd been working in the service for over 15 years was relevant. I'm line managed within the senior management team, but I work across the whole service. Most of my projects, well, all of my projects get commissioned within the senior management team, but the way that those, I've lost my slides.
We can still see them.
We can still see them. When you say you've lost them, Charles.
Oh, here we go. No, I sort of clicked away somehow, yeah. Can you see them?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So the way that I get involved, however, is through a whole range of different routes. I hear about certain teams that may have difficulties. Members within those teams approach me asking for help. So there's all sorts of routes through which all the different teams in the service have access to me. The type of projects that I get involved are probably, just to give you a feeling for the sort of work that I do, I get involved when teams perhaps have got stuck in some way, by which I mean that we get reports that there's multiple incidents, there might be complaints, there might be investigations, there's a sense that there's an unhappiness in the team, in the relationships within the team, or an unhappiness in the relationship with patients. And so that's one sort of situation. For instance, 2 years ago, I got involved in a medium secure unit where there was a series of incidents and complaints that happened, and it became clear that the way the nursing team was working within the one of the wards was extremely procedural and rather harsh, and the relational element of their work had been lost. I also got involved probably about 9 months ago with a low secure inpatient service, which seemed to be slightly kind of rudderless. They wanted to develop a kind of more rehab model of care, but this was not happening. And it became clear that there was a lot of tension between the MDT, the multidisciplinary team, and the nursing team on the ward, and that was undermining any sense of kind of direction on the ward. Okay, those kind of things. The second type of project that I get involved in is when teams are going through some sort of transition, because it seems an important point to try and have an input to help them develop helpful ways of working within the team. So about 2 years ago, I got involved. We had a big transition moving from one forensic community, sort of specialist community team, and it was being divided into 3 teams, which were organized geographically. And that threw up a lot of challenges, particularly in how the different professional groups were going to be divided into the three teams. Perhaps mainly our medical colleagues, and I got involved in helping them think through that and work through that. Yeah. And then the third type of project that I get involved is more as a sort of an ongoing low-level support. Some teams want to have access to somebody who helps them occasionally, infrequently, but regularly, stop and pause to think about what's happening in the team, how are they working as a team. For example, I've done a lot of work with the senior management team, and now I offer a monthly reflective practice group, for that team, to do some thinking about themselves as a team. Just to give you a sense of typically what I do, the setting up and the contracting of my work is quite complicated because it requires, so having received a request to be involved, there's a kind of balance of how to get involved. It requires a sense from the team that I'm independent in some way, that I'm coming in good faith, that I'm going to be helpful, that I can be trusted. In other words, that I'm not just an agent of the senior management team coming to do something to them. On the other hand, I need to have enough authority to justify my intervention in a team. Yeah? And that requires a series of conversations with the team, clarifying what the expectations of my involvement are. The second stage often involves what I've called there a sort of systemic assessment of the problems. And what I do is I talk to as many people individually and as groups within that team. So I assess all parts of the system. It might be at all different grades, from the kind of the newest and sort of lower grades all the way up to the consultants and the psychologists, etc. I also do observations of the team meetings, clinical environments, etc., depending on what's exactly required. And I guess this is one of the privileges of my post, that perhaps I have the unique opportunity to see the system as a whole, which nobody within that system has that opportunity. And that's a very important part of trying to be helpful, to see the whole team as a whole, the whole system. Next stage is very important, which is that I try and gather my thoughts, gather a kind of formulation of what might be happening and how it might be contributing to the problems. And then I set up a whole range of feedback loops to feed that formulation back into the system, not just to the leadership team, but to the nurses on the wards, to the OTs, to the psychologists, to as many people as possible. And the aim of that feedback is not to kind of give a sort of diagnosis of what the problem is. That would be ridiculous. It's more to try and activate the team's own curiosity, the team's own thinking and awareness of what might be happening within that team. So what I'm trying to do at that stage is simply to activate their own curiosity and awareness. And what happens from that point on depends on what happens in that team. Often what has happened is teams want more time to think about what I'm saying. And so I set up a series of usually meetings with groups of members of that team, and different groups. I might mix different groups, the consultants with the charge nurses, the psychologists with the OTs, different groups, in order to set up feedback loops around the information that I have gathered. And occasionally, as part of that, there's a perception that what particular subgroup might need a little bit more help, and then I might get involved in. For instance, in that medium security unit that I talked about, I got involved in the ward with the nursing team on the ward to develop a more relational culture with the patients and between themselves. Gradually, over a period, usually maybe of a year or something like that, or a significant period of time, I kind of try and bring it to a close. Not because everything's been sorted out, not at all, but because hopefully the team has internalized and taking on some awareness and some curiosity about the team's own functioning. And they can continue to do that without my involvement. So the feedback that I received is invariably been positive, which is not surprising because it's a kind of, resource that is offered freely, as it were, to teams. But some of the feedback has been quite interesting. What people have said is that it's very helpful to have an outside perspective, a kind of a sort of fresh pair of eyes on the team, on the system. So that's been important, but also very important that it's offered in good faith, that it's not an attempt to sort of force the team to do anything, but that it's offered in good faith as a source of help. A lot of the feedback has been that what's been useful is to feel heard and understood, and that I have, because I've got more time, I've got the capacity to do that to a level of detail that is not usual within other kind of ways of doing this. And so teams feel that their experience and their thoughts have been heard and understood, and that enhances the team's confidence and way of thinking about themselves. Often the feedback has been that what's been useful is that not that I've given them a solution, but that I've set up process that helps them think about their own difficulties and their own patterns of behavior and relationship. And that's given them confidence, and it's empowered them to try and make their own changes to how they work as a team. And finally, some feedback that when I have been involved a bit more, like on the ward or something, that because my formulations have been more accurate and targeted, that they've been more useful than perhaps sort of blanket interventions from the senior team or something like that. Lots of challenges. I've been running now for about 3.5 years, and in fact, the challenges have become more significant or more clear, really. There's a sort of technical thing about whether this is internal or external consultancy. In a way, it's been quite internal in that because I've worked in the system for a long time, I've made use of my pre-existing relationships with lots of people in the system to sort of to get a foothold in the team, to be trusted to a certain extent. And that's allowed me to get into some of these teams in a way that as an external consultant, I think I would have probably been rejected. On the other hand, because I'm internal, I lose some of the advantages of being an external consultant, which is about being more neutral, not having biases, not being biases. And that's something that we are thinking forward. We're trying to kind of find where the right balance of that is. Inevitably, when I got involved in teams, there's been a degree of resistance. That's normal. In other words, that the teams get stuck not just because they're not aware of what's going on in the team, but sometimes because they don't want to change. And the most effective way of resisting change, we're learning, is to disengage from the process of change. And so a lot of disengagement, a lot of not attending the meetings where thinking is going to happen about the team, not attending team meetings, etc. And so we're having to think about and learn how to work with that. One of the things that I've thought about a lot is to try and prevent teams from thinking that I'm somebody who's going to come and sort out the problems, thereby undermining their own capacity. And so, but that's always a challenge, that when you have an external consultant coming into the team, that the team sort of pushes it over to you to sort the things out, as opposed to activating their own capacity to sort things out. And that's called a kind of dependency group process. So that's been a kind of another challenge. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. We've got a little bit of time.
Charles, thank you very much, and thank you for starting us off as well. It's always really difficult to go first, so
okay.
We will invite some questions. And while we're waiting for questions to emerge, I would just say one of the key phrases that stood out for me, Charles, was this business of the awareness and curiosity of the team for their own functioning, and that kind of role of consultancy for enabling them to have that kind of inward view at times when maybe they have become a bit a bit detached or preoccupied in other systems. I think that's really important. And the other thing I would add is we've tried in the directorate to sort of incrementally increase the capacity for this type of thinking, in that one or two of us also are trained in systems psychodynamic approaches to this sort of consultancy and thinking, which is very different. The other thing I wanted to underline was the difference between that and reflective practice. So, questions. Kim Malone is first, please.
Thank you. So when you've identified that obviously that people are resistant to, so what is the first thing that you would go about then changing in order to get them on board, I suppose?
Okay. So my first stance is that I'm trying to understand the team as opposed to try and make a change. So I never come in trying to change a team. I'm coming in to try and understand. And having developed some thoughts about why the team might be having a particular pattern of problems, you might say in terms of a kind of culture, I then try and share my understanding with them. I'm not really trying to change anything. I'm just simply sharing a perspective. And that's what Jude was sort of saying. I'm trying to activate their own interest, their own awareness of the advantages and the disadvantages of how they are functioning. Yeah. So I'm not trying to challenge anything. I'm just simply sharing a perspective. Now, as that awareness, that is often sufficient, particularly if I set up lots of different types of feedback loops within the team. That's often sufficient. Just simply that awareness is often sufficient to start jiggling the team and changing some of the patterns of relationship. However, if after all of that, I do start thinking that there is some what we might call resistance, although exactly what we mean by resistance would need to kind of be thought about quite carefully, then it depends on what the nature of that resistance is. But really, the only tool I have is to have conversations with people. And so I start having conversations with different members of the team in different configurations, in different groupings. I start to have conversations about what's going on, why, this is a problem that I'm seeing. I try and understand why they're resisting, as it were, and try and promote conversations which shift the thinking. So there's never any forcefulness. The only tool I have is the capacity to help people to be aware and to think about and to be curious about their own cultures, and but also as part of that, and that this has often been very important, to be aware that there are significant disadvantages about some of the ways in which they may be relating to each other.
We had a real problem with people not wanting to engage in reflective practice or anything like that. So we changed it and called it Cake and Conversation. And it completely, it's the same hour, it's the same people, but because they're eating cake, they were much more engaging. They were much more able. We were still reflecting on their practice and everything that was coming up. But actually, just because we took out the word reflective practice, they engaged much better with it. It was like they didn't seem to think that we were focusing on they'd done something wrong or they weren't doing something right.
Yeah, I mean, reflective practice is only a small bit of it, really. When cultures have got stuck in a particular pattern, you will see the same non-engagement and non-attendance in all sorts of different meetings. And so you have to kind of take it up there. Okay. Joe Brown.
Hi, thank you so much.
Sorry,
that's been really interesting.
I'm wittering away on mute. And Joe, I see you have popped your camera on. I was just going to say, if people with a question feel able to pop the camera, it's not a rule, but it is really nice to see you and be able to, I'm sure for Charles, to interact personally. And we have a question in the chat as well. So sorry, Joe, over to you.
No, that's great. It's been really interesting to hear you articulate. I think that for me, that difference between reflective practice and what sounds almost more interventional, I guess. So I'm a clinical director for a small forensic service up in Edinburgh. We have used cognitive analytic based therapy, but also to inform how we interact as teams and with our patients. But our reflective practice is separate to that, so it's not run on that model. And I guess what I was wondering about is with that more interventional approach with the teams and in terms of their own dynamic and how they're engaging with themselves. And this is me solidly with my manager's hat on, because we've had some interesting discussions about how teams consent to participate in this.
Yeah.
Because it's a little bit more, as you say, it's different to reflective practice where that space is protected in a very different way.
Yeah.
And I'm just interested to hear about how those consent discussions have gone, particularly when you mentioned the resistance and the avoidance.
Yeah, so thank you. That's a very important question, and we haven't found a solution to this. So the commissioning and the contracting of my involvement is complicated, and this is and I guess the two elements of it that I've learned is that one, it has, at least up to now, depended upon pre-existing relationships of some degree with me so people have felt often that they kind of knew me in some sort of way and that they felt that they could trust my involvement. So this is the dilemma between an external and an internal consultant, as it were. So I've been an internal, and that has disadvantages as well, which is that it gives me a foot in, but it also biases my intervention. But the second thing is that teams need to feel that this is definitely offered in good faith, that this is not a tool that's coming from the senior management team to make them change and so on. And that I have negotiated that by having explicit, open conversations with the local senior teams about where I'm coming from. So it's not about hiding the fact that I am line managed through the senior management team, but being very explicit that I'm not coming with an agenda. And that required time and sensitivity to develop trust, essentially.
That's lovely, thank you.
That was a really interesting question. I'm just giving a time check that we have until 12:20, our next speaker, so we do have time. If we don't get to people's questions, there are some really interesting questions coming in the chat as well. We could perhaps, I'm looking to Chido, collate them and come back to them in the open discussion. But just noting Joe, your role in your organisation, just to also say it has needed senior leadership buy-in to this as well, because there is a resource attached, and we as a senior leadership team agreed that this was an approach we wanted to take, and that we would invest. It's modest amounts, but we would invest in Charles's time, in increasing that capacity a little bit, and in some system psychodynamic training as well. So now, who is next? I think next is from Sheena in the chat. So does it help for teams to have regular, skilled, reflective practice sessions in order to develop an awareness of the way they work, in order to prevent some of the reasons you might be called in for?
I'm feeling from the discussion that there's a sort of confusion between reflective practice and what I'm doing. Reflective practice is really, although as it happens, I also lead on the reflective practice provision within our service. It's so important. It's actually quite different. Reflective practice is a space for a team to think about their experience, ongoing difficulties, either within the relationship with their patients or the relationship between themselves. But that's one type of intervention to help a team. The organizational consultant is a consultancy intervention, is that I come in as an external person in response to a particular problem, usually that's arisen, and I am a consultant. I'm offering an external intervention. It's not about a meeting. I can then proceed in whichever way I see fit. And so I'll have many different meetings with as many different people in many different situations. So the two things are sort of different, really. Perhaps the The similarity is that both interventions in their own way are trying to enhance a kind of reflective capacity in the team, meaning that the team is able to be curious and thoughtful about its own functioning. But these are two slightly separate approaches. Do I think reflective practice is helpful? I guess I would say yes, because we offer reflective practice groups within each of our teams, all of our teams. So we have probably 15 or 16 different reflective practice groups. The person who asked at the beginning about how that is labeled or named is important. But the whole process of setting up reflective practice in a way that is helpful, that is accepted, that works reasonably well, is a totally different conversation than the one that I'm trying to have today. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge worth taking and investing in. But it's a challenge. Yeah.
Thank you, Charles. It's been really helpful. I'm actually a carer and I'm also a reviewer. And I was very much thinking that with the previous person who said that they changed reflective practice to cakes and conversation means that people aren't naturally curious. So I do see what you're doing. And I love the idea, personally, that people have got you to come in. And I do see being an outsider and offering a fresh pair of eyes, a fresh pair of skilled eyes, a real opportunity for teams to look at themselves. So thank you. It's been fascinating.
Hello, Sheena.
Hi, Jude.
Hi. That was a very helpful question, Sheena, because actually I was going to invite you, Charles, to say something about the difference between this approach and reflective practice. So there was someone else had their hand up, but it has gone down, and I'm very sorry, but I don't remember.
It was Chris Seidman. Chris Seidman.
Okay, so Chris, if you still have your question, would you like to ask it?
Yeah, I was just conscious of time, that's all, so I just popped it down just in case there wasn't time.
So we have 20 past, and there's one more question in the chat. But as I say, we can come back to.
Thank you. So my name's Chris. I'm a PALS officer for the Adult Forensic Unit down at Edenfield in Prestwich.
Hello.
So hello. It was just the way I like to do things myself, which is great, is try and activate own curiosity and awareness. And I think it's really important not to just sort of sit and tell, and it's good for people to reflect and give their views. But have you got any sort of set of basic questions that are your go-to questions to provoke someone's curiosity that do work? And would you mind sharing those?
Well, I wouldn't mind sharing them, but I don't have a set of questions that I can. I mean, I guess my stance is also one of curiosity. So I go in as a kind of naive observer, and I just wonder why things are happening in this way in relation to the particular problem that's presented. So, but if I were to say what my bias is, as it were, is I'm interested in relationships. So most of my questions will probably be about how do you think you're getting on with that bit, and how do you think you're getting on with that bit, and also how do you observe how they are getting on. So it's three person. So I'm simply asking questions about the connections between every member of the team, either asking one member of the team to reflect upon how they are getting on with another member of the team, or one department with another part of the, psychology or psychiatrists or whatever, or to ask them to reflect upon how two other members are getting on with each other. So asking the OT, how does she think that the psychologist is getting on with the senior nurse? So but often I'm not allowed to ask questions quite so directly. It would be too intrusive. But that's the sort, I will approach that more gently, but that's the sort of network mapping that I'm doing in assessing a team.
No, brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think important to add there something about the model and our interest in system psychodynamic models, because essentially where you have a failure in that sort of, or a challenge to that sort of system working, probably an inevitable outcome is something of a closed culture in whatever setting. So I see in the chat there is a question about specific forensic settings, but I think these processes are ubiquitous.
Can I just comment on that quickly, Jude? So
Sure.
I think forensic services are particularly vulnerable to this because, and this is also just to answer Chris's question, I guess another stance that I bring is that the reason teams are getting stuck in some way and into close culture is because they are under enormous pressure clinically from their clinical work and from the difficulties that the patients are sort of putting upon them. So I will always think in my formulation of a team's functioning, I will always include the clinical context within which they are working, and forensic context and the nature of the difficulties that our patients have and the nature of their relational patterns and so on put a very particular, and the risk issues that people face put a very particular type of pressure upon our teams.
Sure. Task, of course, is always central in the relationship to whatever the task is. Again, I'm making some bid for ubiquity, but I don't want it to turn into a conversation between you and I, and it is 21 minutes past. If it's okay, we will come back to the questions in the chat, and I'm just noting down people who've had their hands up and not been able to ask their questions. So if that's okay, I'll introduce the next speaker. But Charles, thank you very much. That latter point, I think, about the specific contexts and the nuance around forensic work and the task, I think, is something that I'm hoping people will bring us back to in the open discussion. I think that's rich material for a conversation between us. So moving on then, thank you, Charles. And I would like to introduce Sarah Cooper, who is going to talk about restorative practice, and actually invite Sarah to introduce herself more fully.
Hi, thanks, Jude. So yeah,
thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. So I'm just going to share my screen with you all. Okay, can everyone see that okay?
Not as a presentation, Sarah. We can see your PowerPoint document.
Okay. Sorry about that.
If you pop it into presentation mode.
Yeah, I will just do that. Just sorry, it is in presentation mode on my side, so I'm not sure why. Let me just unshare. Share that again, but I'll click the other screen. Here we go. Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Brilliant.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, hi everyone. My name's Sarah Cooper. I'm a forensic psychologist in low secure services with Kent and Medway Partnership Trust. So I work in low secure and locked rehab unit for individuals with learning disabilities who've got a history of offending and are sectioned under the Mental Health Act, but also work alongside our sort of general mental health forensic unit. And then in Maidstone, we have our sister site, which is our medium secure units. And I guess what I'm hoping to present today is a brief overview of how, I guess, over the last decade, restorative practices have become increasingly embedded within forensic mental health services across the UK. I'm going to think about the impact that that's had on staff and patient experiences, and I guess thinking about the cultural change and the shifts that it has the potential and has already made. I'll focus specifically on the work that we've been doing here within KMPT, which includes the development of a restorative ward, and more recently, the exploration of how restorative approaches may be used in our stand against racism. So I'll just start with a very brief overview of what restorative practice is. I'm sure it's something that you've all come across, but if it is new to anyone here, it's a process in which people come together where harm has occurred. The harmer and harmed talk about what's happened, who was affected, and they look to find a way to repair that harm. Traditionally used in probation services, the research has shown it to have really positive outcomes for both the harmed and the harmer, with there being a reduction in the number of repeat offences for offenders and victims finding the process supportive in their own recovery. For the harmer, it's a process of self-discovery and learning, and it enables them to work towards more positive outcomes, both for themselves and also the individual that they've harmed. It also holds them to account for what they've done and help them take responsibility. I think also by being face-to-face with the person they've harmed, cognitive distortions that they may usually hold can be challenged in a much more authentic and sincere manner, cultivating their own victim empathy skills and moral development. And for the person harmed, it offers an opportunity for healing. It offers them the opportunity to understand why the event happened, to ask questions and tell the harmer the true impact of the behaviour, and gives them a chance to play a role in deciding how the harmer can help repair the harm. And I think quite often we see, I guess particularly if you're thinking about the court process, that's the victim having a voice during that process is often very minimal. So with regard to its application to forensic mental health settings, it's very well evidenced, and I'm sure everyone here has seen it, that patients and staff in forensic settings are at an increased risk of exposure to violent and harmful events. And that can include physical and verbal abuse, sexual assault, witnessing property damage and other traumatic events. And it's known that such events can have a significant impact on staff and patient mental well-being, and also impact on that relationship between the individuals. I guess what restorative practice can do is help restore and build those interpersonal relationships where violations have occurred. It can repair the harm and facilitate increased understanding and learning through helpful dialogues. The last 10 years or so has seen the use of restorative practice grow and develop within forensic mental health, and work has been published by a number of professionals, I guess predominantly within the South East. So in Sussex, Andy Cook has done a huge amount of work, and I guess this is where restorative practice and forensic mental health services really first started. And she's looked at how restorative practice can help to repair fractured relationships where patients have harmed staff or other patients, as well as looking at its use in response to patient index offences. In South London and Maudsley, Gerard Drennan has led the way forward in sort of demonstrating how restorative working can enrich the offender pathway for patients. He's written about and presented the many benefits of the approach, and he and his colleague Vin Swanepoel have also adopted a Consultancy programme, which forms a part of their offender recovery pathway, which is built on restorative principles and adapted from the Prison Services Sycamore project. At Broadmoor, James Tapp and his colleagues have shown how restorative practice can be applied to the most complex of cases, and also how it can help improve their incompatibility lists. Estelle Moore's also shown how the approach is well aligned with trauma-informed care, and they also have adopted the approach within their HR service to show how, and have been implementing restorative practice where there is conflict between members of staff. Within KMPT, we've explored how restorative approaches can be adapted to meet the needs of individuals with intellectual disabilities, and developed a model of working that aims to embed restorative practices within everyday practice. There's also been a lot of work that's sort of gone out more globally. So in Australia, Michael Powers has looked at developing a similar approach to what we've used in Kent, and work in the Netherlands by Van Dernsleren, where they've evidenced the benefits of restorative practice in medium secure settings, exploring the experiences of participants. So whilst the evidence is limited, I guess what we have so far shows that interventions can be appropriate in forensic mental health settings, with reports of positive impacts for patients, victims, and also the organisation. And I guess some of those patients, victims include both patients and staff, and also the victims of index offences. So a bit about where I work. So I work across the Brookfield Centre, which is a 13-bed locked rehabilitation unit, and the Tarrant Fort Centre, which is a 20-bed low secure unit in Kent. All patients are male. They present with a wide range of issues, including intellectual disabilities and other developmental disorders, and that's often runs alongside other mental health issues, personality difficulties, and complex trauma. All our patients have been sectioned under the Mental Health Act and have a history of offending seriously risky behaviour. And restorative practice was first set up in our service in response to incidents where patients had caused harm to members of the team or to other patients. Following our first year of offering restorative conferences, so I guess in that first year, it was a very formalised approach to bring the two individuals together to think about the harm that had happened and find a way forward. And following the first year, I completed a service evaluation, and I found whilst we were receiving a high number of referrals, they weren't always safe or appropriate to go forward with a formalised conference. And I guess the type of difficulties that we experienced included patients having difficulties with emotional regulation, impacting on their capacity to engage safely with a restorative conference. Some patients not taking ownership of the harm caused, and there were concerns regarding the motivation of some patients. So drawing on the restorative continuum, which shows, I guess, that spectrum of sort of less formal to more formal approaches, I reflected on these outcomes and felt that there was more we could be doing that would enable our patients to develop the skills to engage. So this led to the development of a restorative ward, also influenced by the work of Sydney Decker, who's looked at sort of community restorative models. I guess that the focus needed to extend from not only finding a safe and meaningful way to respond to incidents of harm, but also to promoting a safe and supportive ward in anticipation of these events, understanding that conflict is a part of life and there will continue to be misunderstandings. I wanted to find a way to work with an already stigmatised group that promoted inclusion and a sense of belonging. And I guess with restorative practice, the ultimate aim is sort of reintegration with the community. Furthermore, I considered how many of our patients had limited experiences and opportunities to engage in meaningful restorative dialogue. Home life has often been quite troubled with significant experiences of trauma and few opportunities to experience and develop skills in building and maintaining healthy relationships. So the aim was to create an environment which fostered awareness, empathy and responsibility, where informal restorative practices became a part of everyday life. So this is, I guess, the restorative wards model that we developed. It sets, sorry, I've jumped ahead there. It's set into 3 tiers, each level feeding into the next. All staff from the ward were trained in informal restorative practices. That was a 2-day training package that myself and a colleague delivered. And they also receive fortnightly supervision to support with the development and maintenance of skills and to reflect on practice as incidents occur. And I guess the ultimate aim is to create a ward in which trusting relationships could be built, providing safe spaces for reflection and growth through restorative dialogue. So the first tier at the bottom is moral engagement, and this provides a foundation where patients are supported to engage in processes that enable them to reflect on behaviours in a meaningful way and build connections. The approach aims to humanise and validate those who have been harmed and promote a culture which encourages ownership of behaviour. And this has been achieved in a number of ways. So effective statements are used to let a person know how we feel and how we're affected by their actions without judgment, and also separating the behaviour away from the individual. Restorative circles provide the opportunity to enhance communication and build a sense of community. So this is something we offer at the moment sort of twice a week. They can help break down barriers, build connections and develop peer support. And they can also support in the development of empathy, allowing patients to see how others hold different views to their own in fun and non-confrontational ways, and provide opportunities for decision making and problem solving. Restorative practices are being built into patient care plans and positive behaviour support plans, ensuring safe and consistent practices are aligned with the individual needs of the patient. And we continue to work towards making ward rounds and review meetings more restorative by considering the language you use is sort of more collaborative and working with those individuals. The second tier, emotional processing. So I guess at this stage where patients are perhaps beginning to feel safer to own their behaviour, we're starting to support them to think about, I guess, the impact on other people. So restorative questions and conversations provide a framework and structure for what could be quite a difficult conversation, helping individuals understand where harm's occurred, the impact it's had, and what can be done to make amends. Circles, again, these are used in response to incidents of harm. So where you've got the circles and you've built that safety and containment on the ward, you can begin to use them to address other issues that might be playing out on the ward. So bullying, for instance, so people talking about their experiences, and this can be done in a very safe way without having to name people and without having to think directly about incidents that have happened on the ward, but it's a chance to listen and reflect on these experiences and what they may be like. And there is the space there for those who've been harmed to voice their needs, I guess. And group work, here I've been thinking about how restorative principles can be incorporated into treatment groups. And one example of this is an active ally group, which I co-designed with some colleagues, and I'll come on to tell you about a little bit later. And then the final tier supports patients in rebuilding their relationships. So by engaging in such structured dialogues and engaging in the more formal end of restorative conferencing, it provides the opportunity to explain how they would like to repair the damage, how they make positive change in their life, and experience the process of reintegration. And I guess the person who's been harmed remains central to each process. They're empowered through having their voice heard, and they're free to ask any questions. They can address the harmer directly if they want to. It's an absolutely voluntary process, I must add, and can tell the harmer that what they need to move forward if they feel comfortable in doing so. So what we found from sort of piloting this intervention, so we piloted for 6 months on our acute units, and outcomes for staff revealed improvements approaching statistical significance in measures of therapeutic hold, patient cohesion, and experience safety. So feeling much safer on the ward, feeling more I guess, engaged with the patients, as well as there being a reduction in the harms experienced on the unit, although I must add there are obviously going to be other reasons that contributed to those findings as well. Restorative circles helped build connections between staff and patients. They created a forum where trust could be developed, facilitated a way for patients to explore their feelings and hear how others thought differently to them. Restorative working was well regarded by staff and patients. They advocated for the approach to be rolled out onto other wards. And with regards to challenges, because there were some, I guess the capacity to deliver restorative working was very sensitive to the changing dynamics within the service, including organisational changes which led to quite a diluted approach. Patients moving across ward changed the dynamics of the circles, which would often lead to us needing to sort of reset those circles to build that sort of sense of safety again. Momentum was also sensitive to staff turnover and capacity of staff to attend supervisions. And I guess furthermore, the ongoing maintenance of the approach has also presented some challenges. I guess there will always be challenges, but I believe cultural change is possible, and I think the foundations have been made to sort of continue to build on the work that we have been doing. And I've certainly since trained up staff in our rehabilitation unit, and we've been using this approach for 18 months now, and I think there's positive regard from staff about the merits of the approach. So I'm a bit of a gear change now. So I'm going to, I want to move on now to share, I guess, how we've begun to think about how this approach can be used to confront racism. But I guess first, just wanted to step back and look at what the concerns are. So we know that racial abuse is frequently experienced by staff working in the NHS. The majority of staff from global majority groups have experienced some form of racial abuse at work. And in a survey by the British Medical Association, 76% of staff said they'd been subjected to at least one incident of racist behaviour. 71% chose not to report the incident, either not to be labelled a troublemaker or due to a lack of confidence in adequate action being taken. In a separate report, 71% of staff from global majority ethnic backgrounds complained of race discrimination, found that many organisations' response was either to challenge or to ignore the allegations. And Miller concluded in one paper that the NHS still has a serious problem with racism. Looking more closely sort of within my own trust, a study was conducted by Rowers and Gannon in 2023, and they interviewed staff from across the local secure service And some of their findings included 81% of staff had experienced verbal abuse, with the majority of incidents for staff from global majority groups being race-related. Staff were mentally and physically affected by racial abuse, with the reporting process being long and re-traumatizing, and staff described the consequences for racial abuse as being inconsistent and ineffective. Patients weren't always cautioned or charged for incidents, and furthermore, zero tolerance policy was not being enforced. In addition to this research, I completed some further focus groups with staff from across the low secure forensic units, and I guess the aim of that was to build on the picture of the experiences of staff that I work with. Some of the key findings was that, I guess, very similar to what Rowers and Gannon found, was that staff felt alone and disillusioned in reporting racism. Reporting processes were often re-traumatizing in themselves and cumbersome. Support wasn't always offered to those harmed and to those repeatedly abused, and not enough was being done to challenge racism. And there was a sense where a response wasn't seen, that there was a sense of collusion, and particularly if there was no response. And some staff were fearful of escalation if they confronted racist behaviour. So I guess escalation from the patient. Based on these experiences of my colleagues and my knowledge of restorative practice, I guess I thought about how we might be able to use this approach and proposed a new anti-racism strategy, building on what was shared with me. Currently, zero tolerance approaches are generally promoted within the NHS. However, staff experiences tell us that this doesn't work. The literature also concludes zero tolerance policy doesn't work in an environment that has to provide care or services to individuals. It's quite a reactive approach, which doesn't consider underlying causes, attitudes, and behaviours, and shows little in terms of progress and positive outcomes. So I guess thinking about how we can make a shift in how we address racism, restorative practice offers opportunities for meaningful dialogue to support learning and understanding. It provides a safe space to confront and address racism and teach respect for difference. There's a focus on how to foster relationships and build meaningful relationships. And as already discussed today, restorative practice can facilitate a pathway for change and feels like quite sort of fitting way forward. Solutions to racial inequalities need to be aimed at achieving long-term institutional cultural change. And I think witnessing harm creates responsibility for us all, and we're all aware of racism happening. Therefore, we're all responsible in our response. And one quote by Desmond Tutu, which I think highlights this, was, "If you're neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say you're neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality." And restorative practices promote the idea of invested facilitation, moving away from the idea of neutrality. There's a defined process and structure in which the facilitators hear what all parties have to say. They acknowledge historical harms and also make sure their own biases and feelings are not displayed and brought into the room. I think and I guess some comments by Laurel Smith-Bacon and colleagues around neutrality is that it fails to acknowledge historical violence and trauma. It assumes that power is equal when quite often it isn't. It ignores the systemic inequities in an effort to claim objectivity. And whilst it promises a safe space, there isn't questioning of who gets to remain safe. So I think, therefore, we all need to be invested to make meaningful change, and that needs to come from everyone within the culture, I guess, and restorative practice can provide a framework in achieving this. So that the strategy.
Sorry to interrupt. Just a time check. You have just over 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So the strategy that I've sort of looked to develop from the experiences of colleagues is built on 4 levels: prevention, disruption, promotion of disengagement, and addressing the impact. And woven into each principle, into each area, is restorative principles. So prevention looks at what we can actively to promote equality. It aims to build connections and understanding and celebrate diversity. So the strategies incorporated into this include having respect days and cultural days, which are events which bring everyone together to celebrate diversity, citizenship programs. We have ward reps to ensure that this remains an issue that's on the agenda in all our meetings, restorative circles, so using that space to foster and build those relationships, and also an active ally group, which is a program I designed with colleagues aimed to promote and support patients in becoming active anti-racism allies. It relies on engagement and invested facilitation from the wider MDT and sits within the wider strategy for tackling racism. And it's a 12-week programme, and restorative principles are woven into it. So through discussion, reflection, the harms experienced are shared by those that come to the group. And inspired by the work by Drennan and Swamhole, Kintsugi forms part of the group where patients create an object that symbolises the values that hold true for their ward. The object is broken, representing the harms encountered, and using gold, the object is mended. So the harms aren't hidden but acknowledged, and all think about how they would like to move forward. And an active ally plan for the ward that's owned and shared by the ward is developed within that process. We've also, within the service, designed a service statement, and that's displayed on all of our wards and across our therapeutic areas. I will, rush through these because I realise time is running out. So the next level is disruption, and that looks at how staff can feel safe and confident in responding to racism. So that's providing staff with training, enabling them to do that. So teaching about the use of effective statements and restorative questions so that racist behaviour can be named and challenged. Holding people to account and creating a meaningful dialogue, supporting both learning and understanding for those individuals who have caused the harm, also empowering those people who have been harmed to have a voice in what they need to go forward and how they'd like that relationship managed. An anti-racism and active allied care pathway is something we're also looking to develop, which would include an assessment of attitudes and behaviour on admission and an individualised care plan throughout their treatment with us. And then the final step is working with the police to improve outcomes for victims of racism. And there also needs a need for the service to be transparent for staff in what to expect from the police. The next here, promotion of disengagement, looks at opportunities for learning for individuals who present with both overt and more subtle forms of racism. So here I'm looking to design a challenging racism group, and it will mirror other offence-based programmes where formulation and understanding will be central to the design, exploring how racist attitudes are formed for the individual and what maintains them. It needs to sit within the wider tackling racism strategy where there are other opportunities to authentically challenge and address racist views. The group will sit within the patient's anti-racism care pathway, and there'll be training for staff on reflecting how their own behaviour, prejudice and unconscious bias may play out, as well as exploring how to model being anti-racist. And then the final strategy, addressing the impact, looks to improve ways staff and patients who are victim of and witnesses to racism are supported. So the first is is to prepare and inform staff of the environment in which they've come to work. So as we touched upon earlier, forensic services staff are exposed to increased stresses, threats and challenges. So it's making individuals aware of that and aware of the support that would be available to them. Improving our processes for those who have been harmed by unifying follow-up approaches so that individuals have a voice and are aware of how it's been addressed for the individual who caused the harm. And then other practices that are in place, so reflective practice, supervision, escalating concerns, and also making sure that we meet the needs of witnesses, bystanders, and also bank staff. So this is my last slide, so I'm pretty much there. So in summary, restorative practices hold real potential for cultural change within forensic services, improving the experiences of staff and patients. More research is certainly needed, further evidencing the outcomes, although published results from a range of settings is encouraging and offers much hope. And the tackling racism strategy described in this presentation is very much in its infancy. I'm continuing to learn as I'm doing this work, and there are areas still to develop. And it will be evaluated, as we go along. And I've put there a quote from Falia Davis, who's spoken a lot about the use of restorative practice in response to racism. So I'll let you read that, and I will finish there. Thank you.
Sarah, that was amazing. And I kind of feel we got two topics for the price of one there, which is, and two really interesting topics. That was an absolute bargain. We are scheduled for a 10-minute comfort break right now, so I'm not going to take questions for you if that's okay, because I think there's so much material there that I'm really hoping that will get us started in the open discussion after our next speaker. In particular, you've talked about one or two of my preoccupations, which I have no doubt, whatever the discussion today, I will be coming to you to talk about further, kind of, face to face if possible. But really interesting. Thank you. I see lots of claps for you.
Thank you.
And I'll add to that. And just one very quick question: is it possible to share your slides more widely than this group? We will circulate all the slides just to people on the call. Right, bang on time. We're going to take a quick break until 1 o'clock. So quick break to grab a cup of tea, and then our next speaker will be at 1 o'clock. We have half an hour for that speaker before we move to the open discussion. And I really hope that these themes are going to come into the open discussion and we can have a really rich conversation between us. So see you all in 10 minutes. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. So I can't see anybody, but I'm going to assume that everybody's coming back, and I'm going to move to our next speakers. Are going to talk about the way that peer support can help us to support positive cultures and positive cultures in our environments. So I'm going to invite you, Beth, to introduce your team, because I think that you're presenting together. Do we have Beth?
Yep, I'm here.
Hello.
Hey,
thank you
hi,
very much
everyone.
for coming.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, I have to say we were not expecting quite so many people, so excuse us if we seem a bit nervous. But yes,
it's amazing, and well, yes, I was going to say no need to be nervous, but I was very nervous myself. So, but it so far has gone very well.
Yeah, yes, it's been really super interesting speakers, and yeah, thanks so much for inviting us. It's kind of helping that I can't see all 148 people at once.
Well, I can assure you there will be an interested audience, an interested and supportive audience.
Good. Cool. Well, I'm Beth. I am the service user involvement and engagement lead for North London Forensic Service. And we are the forensic lived experience and engagement team. So our presentation is a bit different from what else you've seen today. It's a bit much more informal. We don't have any like slides or studies to share with you. We are just going to share our perspectives, I suppose, on what we've encountered like relating to staff cultures through our work in lived experience. So we were supposed to be 5 of us. 2 of our team members unfortunately weren't able to make it, including the person who chose the topic. So we will try our best to give the positive spin on it that he was hoping. But as you can imagine, being from the peer and lived experience side of things, we've also faced a lot of challenges when it comes to staff cultures and attitudes. So to put it into context, I suppose, we've had peer workers in our service for, I want to say, 5 years. So we started with just a very small team of a team lead and then 2 peer workers, and now a few years later we've kind of expanded and like spread peer work a bit more across, I suppose, like everything within the service. So we do a lot of co-working with all the other departments, and we did have a team of 7 peer workers, which unfortunately, this is another challenge we face, is with staff retention. unfortunately has dwindled down to 3, but 2 of those, in fact, one of those people and one of those ex-people are here to talk to you today. So yes, well, also I was going to say these 2 obviously didn't prepare as much to fill the time because we thought that there was going to be 4 of us. So if we have a bit of time left over after Caroline and Tanya have spoken, I can share a little bit about what the other 2 were going to present, or we can hand the time over to your questions for the people who are actually here.
That sounds lovely, and we'll go with whatever feels right and comfortable. And let me know if there's anything I can do to help.
Cool, thank you. All right, Caroline, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Caroline. I, until about 2 weeks ago, was one of the peer support workers with the Forensic Lived Experience and Engagement team for the Forensic Division of the North London NHS Foundation Trust based out of Chase Farm Hospital. So a little bit about me. I have a diagnosis of EUPD and a lifelong lived experience of eating disorders, self-harm behaviour. A full clinical catalogue, unfortunately. But it has given me a great amount of insight as to what it's like to be a person who has kind of constant, consistent relationships with different levels of medical care when it comes to my mental health. I have a degree in anthropology that I obtained from UCL, and a big part of that degree was about thinking about cultures, kind of a lot of what's been talked about today, thinking about cultures, thinking about inequalities, and a lot of stuff that I think when I approach peer work, which when I first went into the role, I really didn't know a great deal about what peer work actually was, but it was something that I knew that I wanted to bring to the role, which was helping the people that I was working with, be it other staff or service users, to feel represented, understood, heard, and to kind of connect the gap that can naturally form the kind of the divide between the us and them divide, as we often call it in our team of clinical teams and healthcare providers and service users. So yeah, like I said, I didn't really have a great deal of experience either with what peer work was or with what working in forensic would be like when I came into the job. It was something that I started about 2 years ago, beginning of 2023, and had come pretty much fresh out of university. But like I said, had this background of lived experience and lots of experience with being in and out of hospital. So it was different. I'd never been in forensic service myself, but I had peers who had been in groups with who had, and I have extensive friendship groups and of people who have lots of different kinds of experiences when it comes to having contact with mental health services. So I felt like there was a difference that I could provide in my own experience. The thing that I felt that I brought was a strength was showing to people who had been effectively in that kind of care for a very long period of time that you can live successfully and live well in the community, having had, a very long history of what feels like negative experiences with healthcare providers and being institutionalized effectively. So when I went into the job, I think one of the things that I didn't really know about not just me, but also across our service was what is a peer support worker? What do we do? Who are we? What do we represent? What do we bring to the role? And what our responsibilities were. Like that was a thing that I think it was a continuous dialogue that I had with other members of my team and my managers over the time that I was working in the service. And it's something I've reflected on a lot since leaving the service is you kind of have to be a little bit of a jack of all trades in lots of ways. You have to bring lots of parts of yourself in the way that you bring your lived experience. You also have to bring your interests and your hobbies and, just the way that you see the world to the job. And that comes both from a perspective of connecting with service users, but also from relating those experiences to other staff members in a way that is approachable, that is understandable, something that people can empathize with, things that touch points for other human beings, you know, on a basic level. So when I was in post, my work was split generally between running a number of different groups in the inpatient recovery college, which would involve, it was different creative activities. It was basically a lot of spaces where people would gather to do things that they kind of semi-vocational or craft activities that were very casual spaces where people could also just sit, chat, you know, have a cup of tea, just generally gathering spaces and places to kind of, I guess, build confidence as well, and build communication skills. So that was one thing that I did. I also worked on organising and running the hospital newsletter, which was something that we felt was really important. Like, there's lots of staff newsletters and bulletins, but there wasn't really anything that was co-produced that allowed service users to have a collective voice across the entire hospital and the community that was led by and run by, you know, EBs and peer workers. You know, they have service user forum. It's all very quite structured and formalized, but this was an opportunity for people to share things that weren't necessarily worries or concerns, but, you know, opportunities to celebrate achievements or to talk about interests. And that's what it very much became. It was very much general interest. And I was really proud of that piece of work, actually. It was very popular across the different wards. And amongst the staff as well, always made sure to distribute it amongst the staff, because I felt like it was a really positive thing to make the connections between what the service users were experiencing on a holistic level, not just on a clinical level, about, you know, what their lives look like, rather than, you know, what does their case look like, their files look like. So I think that was a really positive force across the hospital. And also I was providing some support for community groups as well. So for people especially who were in the transition period between living in the hospital as inpatients and then living in the community, and how difficult that can be, because that obviously is an area of expertise that I feel like I have more experience in, of being a person who has to continue to go to appointments when living in, you know, in outpatient, and coming in and having those relationships on site and then going home again. So yeah, it was a very mixed bag. It was a lot of different things, wearing a lot of hats, basically, lots of different things and lots of communication. I think, like I said, the most successful aspect of what I achieved while I was in post was really finding ways to try and establish connections between groups of people, not just service users, but between different staff groups on different wards, when it came to using the newsletter to do that, creating different groups of, I guess, identity in readers, you know, creating a community that was around this one document that wasn't just about staff from different wards and different places. It was about recognizing that, you know, it's a collective community at the hospital of service users and staff alike on all teams. I think being present and visible generally on the wards is something that myself and other members of my team are all really proud of, that we get to do, is we really get to allow service users and staff to see how, I guess, a person at a different stage in their recovery and their journey can exist in that space in comparison to where they were earlier in their recovery, and it provides, I guess, another a point on a timeline that shows that, you know, that we can't be denied temporality as people who recover. You become a different version of yourself, and I guess that, again, breaking down the us and them thinking. Sorry, I'm just having to go through my notes. I've got I have to think about what I was going to say, because I was having to say more than I was going to say. Yeah, so I think one of the things that I really personally struggled with when I was in post, though, was because of having to constantly define what my identity was as a peer support worker. I mean, for a start, our team was very unique. Our team is very unique from the rest of the other clinical teams, because of the fact that we have that our experience isn't necessarily in our qualifications, but it is in our lived experience, and that can be something that I think sets us aside a little bit. And there's definitely a sense that the different teams within the hospital can be a little bit sort of cliquey, and teams grouped together. I can just see in the chat that there are a lot of wards, so there are a lot of independent teams. So having a sense of cohesion across that is something that's quite challenging, and also communicating who we were as a limited team of people across all of those wards, and helping especially the nursing staff who were on particular wards understand the connections that we were trying to make with service users. That could be a real challenge at times, to get other members of staff to support the work that we were doing, getting them to accompany people from wards to come to groups, or to make space on wards for us to be there with service users. I think as well, just because of the nature of forensic work, and I mean, some of the stuff that's been covered, the experiences that some staff have when it comes to service users, there is in society, stereotypes and attitudes when it comes to thinking about people with different mental health diagnoses, even, amongst healthcare professionals, that I know that I personally am quite wary of anyway when it comes to having relationships with people who work in healthcare, because of just my own lived experience. But that is something that I feel like I personally ran into a few times, and had different interactions with staff that didn't feel positive because of just the way that they perceived me based on my background, my identity. And yeah, I think, like I said, because of the pathways to do with how isolated our team was and how different it was from what everybody else was doing, the resolution to that felt very incomplete. And because of the communication around what peer work is in our trust, I think kind of rectifying how we were to be understood and to be treated is something that it's still a work in progress. But ultimately, I think it's definitely a force. Reflectively, looking back on 2 years of work, I think the impact that peer work has and can have in a forensic setting is so important, because of the fact that it is this connection between groups of people that can feel worlds apart and feel very disconnected. And it is extremely empowering for both us and for the service users. And I've had a great amount of feedback from different staff members saying about what a resource we were to draw on. It was a great resource for people to draw on, especially when it came to educating new staff who were starting to see, before, I guess, patterns of thinking were established to do with, well, this is what a patient is and this is how a patient behaves. Seeing that a person is a dynamic thing, and that recovery, though it takes time, a person can achieve a massive amount over the time that they are in recovery, and gain a great deal of confidence and really kind of unlock their capabilities when it comes to, I guess, understanding themselves and caring for themselves and for others. So yeah, I think there's for all that, there's a lot of shortcomings. There's a great amount of potential in what peer work can be, which I think my colleague Tanya is gonna cover a bit next. So.
Thank you. You've just under 15 minutes left in your slot, Becky. I think it's all right if questions spill into the open discussion. There's not much of a difference between questions and discussion, probably.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you.
That was really great. And I was thinking while you were talking, actually, that it is, so hard, I think, to see sometimes, or to feel like the positive impact that you're making on service users who like so clearly appreciate the work you're doing, because you feel like you're battling so hard against a staff attitude that is a bit resistant to the kind of change in the ways of working as well. So yeah, I just want to say like how grateful I am to have had you in the team and to get to work with you. Tanya, are you ready to talk us through your bit? Tanya was talking more about her kind of vision for the future of peer working in our team as well.
Okay, hi everybody. My name's Tanya.
Hello, Tanya.
Hi, I'm a peer support work coordinator for the North London Forensic Service. So I work with Beth, and I also worked with Caroline when she was working with us. I'll just give you a brief kind of understanding about me. So I actually was a former patient in the North London Forensic Service. I left in 2012. I was discharged, and I began working first of all as an expert by experience, and then as a peer about 3.5 years ago. But I'd just like to say that in my experience as a peer, and in speaking to other peers across the Barnet, Enfield and Haringey Mental Health Trust, peer support work, I know the saying is quite classic, ward to board, but literally peer support from board level right the way down to, you know, just on the wards with nurses and TIs and healthcare assistants can be so impactful, because if the person is willing to kind of understand the peer, they can get a lot of experience from a peer. For example, a doctor, for example, could be dealing with one of his service users, and he's going to come across with like diagnosis, medication, treatment, maybe psychology. But with a peer, we have lived experience, so we understand the system because we have personal experience of the mental health system, from being on medication, for example, and suffering the side effects, to dealing with doctors, dealing with nurses, understanding the positives, the negatives of the system. And so from every level of the NHS in mental health services, every single level, peer work and peers are relevant to how someone can practice and improve their practice if they're willing to kind of engage with peer support and lived experience. Because our experience is not a qualification that we've gone to learn in college or university, but it's our own life experience. So what we've lived through our own eyes, our own personal experience, what we've actually experienced. This is the most important part of peer support and lived experience, and this is what we have to offer. So our school, our qualification is School of Life. Our qualification is our own lived experience and what we've been through. And on every level, it can be useful, right from board level in understanding logistics of how the wards work, or recovery practices, anything like that. Peer support work can be helpful, right down to like the nurses on the wards, activities on the wards, the attitudes of nurses towards peer support, because a lot of it can be them and us. Because when I was on the ward, for example, you did feel the gap between the patients and the staff. Not all the time. Some staff were nice, but we weren't staff. We were the patients. We were the ones that were there. We were the ones that were being treated, so we didn't see ourselves as the same as staff. We saw ourselves as though they were different from us. And so in peer work, I feel that with peer work, as peers, we cover that middle ground between staff and patient. We're the bridge between the staff and the patient. So, for example, with me, I was actually a service user at the hospital that I work at now. It was a number of years ago, so a lot of things have changed, but I was actually a service user there. And so when becoming a peer, I felt as though I had a lot of kind of understanding, and could kind of understand where the patients are coming from, because I was once that person. And so as a member of staff, the only thing I would say is that I never wanted any of the people, like the service users that I worked with, to see me as the way that they may see their doctor or their nurse or their OT, but to see me more as somebody who has been there before. I've been in their shoes. I've done that path. I know what they're going through. I've done the whole system of unescorted leave to, you know, to escort, to going out by myself, to getting accommodation, to living independently, to getting an absolute discharge. You know, I've done all of that. And so I wanted them to understand not only that I'm like them because I've done that, but also that me being there as a peer shows the patients and gives them, in a sense, a beacon of hope to understand, well, okay, if this is possible for this person, who some of the patients that are at the hospital that I work at, some of them are still there from when I was a patient, not all of them, but some of them are still there. And so they can see that, okay, if it's possible for you to kind of, you know, leave the hospital and get on with your life and have a life for yourself, then maybe it's possible for me too. And to give them that hope that, you know, things are possible. I mean, one thing that I advocate a lot of as a peer to the service users that I work with is that, yes, I have chosen peer support and it has helped me in my recovery journey, but that also everybody's recovery journey is different. Peer support may work for me, but it doesn't mean it's the only route of recovery for everybody. You could want to, for example, go to the gym and improve your physical health, work on your body, work on your diet. There could be I don't know, an interest that you have, a hobby that you've always wanted to do and you've never had the chance to do it because of, you know, maybe you've been in hospital or, you know, something's held you back. So recovery looks different for everybody, you know, and these are the kind of things that as peers we can bring into mental health services, into the NHS, to show them that recovery is a journey and it looks different for everybody, but everybody is as equal as everybody else. You know, so one person they may be a peer and it may look like they're doing more, or somebody could just decide, you know what, I'm going to start going to the parks and I'm going to start taking more walks and I'm going to start going for coffees and, you know, sitting down and maybe people watching or doing a bit of retail therapy, but equally it's still very important.
I'm just going to give you a little time reminder. You have about 4 minutes left in your slot.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, and yeah, so that's, but also I just wanted to say that I have been on like forums with other peer members across our trust, and one of the things that peers say that they face negatively is, like I said before, being a peer doesn't require a qualification. For example, a doctor will go to university and learn for 7 years or however long it takes to qualify, whereas us as peers, we don't actually have a qualification as such, as in there's no certificate that we can go for, no degree that we can study to say, well, okay, we're qualified. It's our own personal experience of life that has given us the experience and the qualifications and the kind of right to say, well, okay, we're qualified here, we know what we're doing because of our experience of the system. And so peers have come across, like, for example, you know, being maybe in a room full of OTs and they might be asked, okay, so what are your qualifications? Like, what qualifies you to do the role? And so sometimes we do come across that kind of culture of like, well, you're not educated to a certain standard, therefore your kind of experience or the qualities that you bring to the role are not going to be as kind of, you know, qualified or relevant as maybe a doctor or an OT or a psychologist, because we haven't had the education and experience, but we have had the life experience, you know, and that's what brings us to the role more, and what would help to kind of change the cultures in the NHS if lived experience was more part of a more integrated and more integral part of the way that the system worked, so that our kind of opinions and our experiences can be filtered down to help more with the patients and the service users and outcomes for others in the mental health system.
That was amazing, right? Almost right on time. Thank you. Thank you so much. Beth, it's just about at the end of your slot. Did you want to add anything before I open for questions, and we'll spill questions into the discussion?
No, I've got nothing to add in particular, but yeah, I'll answer on behalf of our other two colleagues who aren't here, because I know some of their views that they wanted to share. So if any questions come up around them, I'll jump in. That's
really helpful. Thank you. Just a couple of comments from me to get us started. I just want to sort of hold on to the standout phrase for me, Tanya. What you've said is if people are willing to engage with peer support and lived experience, it really speaks to me about culture and the way in which we are trying to promote cultures in which people do that, and that's one of our measures perhaps of whether we've got healthy cultures in our organisations. And I also just wanted to point out that for me, Caroline's input very much links in my mind to some of the things that Charles said, our first speaker, in thinking about systems and thinking about how you communicate across those systems. And I'm also really fascinated in your anthropology background, Caroline, because as organisational consultants, we think of ourselves as anthropologists and as kind of immersing ourselves within systems. So I think that's really interesting. But I'm going to open up for questions now. And Chido, if it's okay with you, I think we just morph seamlessly into the open discussion. Contradict me if that's not okay. But if so, we didn't take any questions for Sarah, and we can take questions for the last speakers as well.
Did you want me to stop recording now, Jude, or should we keep recording?
I think maybe stop recording now.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah,
just see where the conversation takes us. So maybe it would be good if people pop your hands up and or use the chat. Chido and I might have to be a bit of a joint effort spotting them all.